Welcome. I'm Lori Saito and I'll be giving you the lecture on the RN scope of practice. Some of the basic objectives that we'll cover for the class today are the purpose of a board of nursing, the scope and standards of practice, the RN versus LPN roles and scope of practice in Oregon, and the conduct derogatory to the standards of nursing. I understand that you received this information last year for the LPN scope of practice. As this is a ladder program, today's emphasis is on the RN scope of practice. Licensure is necessary in that there needs to be some type of objective method to prove that the individual is qualified to practice nursing safely. As with other agencies, the practice of nursing has regulations. The highest authority are federal statutes. In nursing, the statute came down from the federal level declaring that nursing will be regulated at the state level, not at the federal level. So state statutes were then set in place by organizations such as the Oregon State Board of Nursing to regulate nursing practice. The OSBN statutes are specific to our nursing practice in this state, and each state has its own statutes for that state. You need to be aware of your scope of practice in each state as it varies. For example, when I practiced in Washington after nursing school, it was within my scope of practice to be able to take arterial blood gases. When I moved to California, this practice was under the respiratory therapist and was not within my scope of practice for that state. Another state-specific statute you need to be aware of is whether continuing education units or CEUs are required by your state. If they are required, how many are required and how often? For example, for my California RN license, I had to have 30 CEUs every 2 years. And although I am not required to have CEUs to renew my Oregon RN license, I am required to have 125 CEUs every 2 years to renew my nurse practitioner license in Oregon. For the sake of today's lecture, I will be referring to the Oregon State Board of Nursing, or OSBN. The Nurse Practice Act is the administrative law that grants the OSBN authority to write rules that further define that law. These administrative laws from the Board of Nursing are issued as rules and regulations. They have the effect of law, and they help define safe and competent practice. So even though they are not laws, the nurse is still bound by them as if they were actual laws. The OSBN will also issue board policies. These can be position statements or declaratory rulings. They are less formal but may be equally binding as rules and regulations. These statements help to define the nurse's scope in areas where practice may be changing. Finally, you have institutional policies. Rules and procedures that are made by the institutions in which you will work. Remember, the facility's policies may be more restrictive than the statutes, rules, and regulations, but they may never be less restrictive. OSBN's nursing mission statement is to safeguard the public's health and well-being by providing guidance for and regulation of entry into the profession, nursing education, and continuing safe practice. The OSBN is comprised of 9 governor-appointed members, which include 2 members from the public. The board meets 5 times a year, and meetings are open to the public. The main charge of the OSBN or any state board of nursing is public protection. So to help safeguard the public, the board has the following rules. To determine licensure and certification requirements. This is done by issuing licenses and renewals. The NCLEX RN exam that you will sit to take at the end of the year is exactly the same in every state. There is no difference no matter which state you take your test for. They will set standards and scope of practice by establishing public policy on nursing regulatory issues. They will interpret the Oregon Nurse Practice Act, and that will help to provide guidance for our scope of practice. They approve nursing education programs to ensure that students, such as you, are meeting minimal educational levels. They investigate complaints, investigate complaints and identify inappropriate conduct and performance, such as practicing outside your scope of practice and standards, and they take disciplinary action regarding licensure based upon their investigations. They propose legislative concepts. An example of this is approximately 9 years ago, the state of Oregon legislated that every nurse in the state of Oregon, the first time they renew their Oregon license, has to take 7 CEU units on pain. Once you do that, you don't have to do it again. And they will also provide testimony to the legislature and other organizations to influence public policy. So, licensure, why do we have it? As I said earlier, there has to be some type of objective method to prove that the individual is qualified to practice nursing safely. So it is established to set a minimum level of competency to protect the public. It is required. In order to practice nursing, one must pass a licensure examination, the NCLEX, and become registered by the State Board of Nursing in the state in which you want to practice. So you have to have a license for each state that you choose to practice in. Now, compact states are a little bit different. What they do is they allow you to practice until you're able to get your license from the state. For example, Idaho and Montana are part of a compact state. If I have my license in Montana, if it was still active, I could go work in Idaho even though I don't have my license yet, and I would be able to work until my Idaho license arrived. In other states that are not compact states, you are not allowed to do any type of patient care until you actually have a license in hand. So what the board does not do is it does not serve as a membership organization for nurses or regulate conditions of employment. It does not regulate practice settings or independently change the Oregon revised statutes. And finally, it does not make or change regulations without a public process. So what is scope of practice? It is all the activities in which a nurse may engage at his or her level of licensure. In addition to the state-specified scope of practice, each nurse has an individual scope within a broader scope. So your individual scope is determined by in-service education, continuing education, practice experience, etc. Standards incorporate the documentation of how the competency of a new nursing activity is achieved and how the competency for that activity is maintained. For example, if you went on to get training and certification to be a diabetic educator, there are certain requirements that are mandated that you have to do in order to maintain that certification to be able to do that activity. So just because an individual receives additional training does not mean you're allowed to perform that duty. New training within the scope has to be recognized by the nursing profession as proper to be performed by the Oregon nurse. So it has to be something that's okayed by the nurse. Scope, therefore, cannot be expanded by those outside of nursing, such as by a physician. For example, when I was working as a school nurse in California, the California Board of Education stated that I could have an aide perform certain skills which were normally performed by a licensed professional, such as a CNA who was trained in that, or an LPN. Although the California Board of Education was a state-level agency, my California State Board of Nursing was explicit that this was not within my scope of practice to delegate this skill to an unlicensed professional. So know your practice. So, what are we responsible to know for our practice and why do we care? Your nursing license is your rice bowl. This is your credential that allows you to work as a licensed nurse at whatever level you have licensure. It is your responsibility to protect your license by performing within your scope of practice. As an RN, this is the division that we are responsible to know as it covers our scope of practice and standards. Division 45 is what it's called for short, and it has the scope and standards for RNs and LPNs. As you can see, the various sections that apply to all the nurses and those for RNs in particular. For example, it has definitions of who is what, whether what a nurse is, a registered nurse, a CNA, an LPN, a teaching assistant, whatever it is, they have definitions of what those individuals are called. They have standards for all licensed nurses that we are all responsible for performing, no matter what our licensure level. We have the scope of practice standards for the LPN and the RN. They have conduct that they consider derogatory to the standards of nursing, which could place your license in jeopardy if you perform any of those. They maintain a criminal conviction history, and they talk about what that means if you have one to your license. They discuss mandatory reporting that we as RNs and LPNs and all nurses have to do, and they discuss civil penalties. So this is the division that you need to know. This is the one that can differ from state to state. So standards for all licensed nurses are things that we all have to do regardless of our level of licensure. For example, client advocacy. That is one of the main things in our practice, is being an advocate for our clients. We have to maintain a safe environment of care for our patients. We have to observe ethics when we work. This gives us our professional accountability and competence. We are responsible for maintaining currency on nursing technology. This includes not only the electronic medical records, which are coming in everywhere, but also, did you get a new blood pressure cuff? Do you have new monitoring equipment? Is there new equipment that you have to use for your job? You have to maintain your knowledge of operating those safely. As an RN, we have a responsibility for assigning and supervising care. LPNs also do for supervising CNAs. And we have all responsibility for accepting and implementing orders. So let's look closer at just a few areas on the RN and LPN roles and scopes of practice in Oregon. Under nursing practice implementation, RNs perform initial and ongoing comprehensive and focused assessment. LPNs practice under the clinical direction of the RN, and the RN is the one who has authority to make changes in plan of care. For those of you who work in long-term care as an LPN, this is an area that you have to be very careful, because they are requesting that you do initial and ongoing assessments of patients if the RN is not around, and that is not within your scope of practice. So be careful. Under nursing practice implementation, RNs establish nursing diagnostic statements for patients or their patient population. So they will develop different statements that can be used, and the LPN can select from those available resources the ones that are appropriate for her patient. The RN develops the plan of care with contributions from the LPN to that development. And both have the responsibility for implementing and evaluating the plan of care for the patient. In collaboration with an interdisciplinary team, all licensed nurses are responsible for collaborating and making referrals. However, it is the RN's responsibility specifically, and there is additional language in the scope of practice addressing this, that it is our responsibility to ensure that there has been follow-up on those referrals. Leadership also includes policy and policy making. The RN formulates, interprets, implements, evaluates policies, protocols, etc. And the RN will contribute information to these for her to be able, or him to be able to develop these policies. The RN is going to assume responsibility for development or mentoring of other staff in regards to these policies, or in training if they just need to have it, and the LPN will assist where the RN directs. The RN uses evidence to identify needed changes in practice. The LPN is going to identify changes in clients and practice environment requiring policy change. So in this statement, as you can see, practice is a broad overall umbrella where the LPN is specifically looking at a client or the environment in which they are working. With quality of care, both the RNs and LPNs are going to identify factors which affect quality of care for their patients. Now, the RN will develop the quality improvement standards and processes with input from the LPN. And then the RN will measure the outcomes of the nursing care with input from the LPN participating in giving data. In health promotion, the RN will develop and implement evidence-based health education plans. Now, once these have been developed for the patient, the LPN can select from these and implement them for her patient or patient population. And both the RN and LPN are responsible for evaluation of outcomes, with the LPN evaluating whether or not something was effective and giving that feedback to the RN to determine whether or not that plan of care is working or does it need to be altered. In cultural sensitivity, the RN is usually applying her knowledge on a broad level about cultural differences. So this may be a population, a community, a city, where the LPN is going to apply the basic knowledge more likely to a client or a family of that client. Division 47 is an exclusive practice in delegation to the RN. Even though an LPN is delegating to a CNA, there is somebody else who is overseeing the LPN who has the ultimate responsibility of that delegation, whether it be an RN or a healthcare provider. We're not going to cover delegation here today because more will be taught on this topic in spring term when our focus for the term is management. So let's look at a case study. A nurse arrives at work and is told that the intensive care unit, or ICU, is in need of assistance. The nurse has never worked in the ICU and shares concerns with the supervisor regarding unfamiliarity with the technological equipment used in that unit. The nurse is again told to report to the ICU. Is working in the ICU within the scope of practice for the nurse? As a sidebar, please understand, just by showing up to work, you have an implicit agreement that you are accepting a patient load. Therefore, if you leave, you could be in jeopardy of possible patient abandonment. So let's look at the answer. It is not within the scope of practice for this nurse to perform specialized tasks for which she has not been trained. It is the responsibility of the nurse to set priorities and identify potential areas of harm to the client. The nurse should perform only those tasks in which training has been received, such as taking vital signs, giving medications, hanging IV antibiotics, giving blood, those types of things that the RN has been trained in. It is the nurse's responsibility to clearly describe these tasks. One of the charges of any state board of nursing is monitoring conduct derogatory to the standards of nursing. So this is defined as, in the state of Oregon, as nurses, regardless of role, whose behavior fails to conform to the legal standard and accepted standards of the nursing profession, or who may adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. They may be found guilty of conduct derogatory to the standards of nursing. Now, most derogatory conduct is related to the following areas on this slide: client safety and integrity, communication, And under this communication, failure to clarify a questionable order falls in this area. It is our responsibility to safeguard the patient. And if you're not sure about an order, you will be held liable if the order is questionable if you perform that. Also, other derogatory conduct is achieving and maintaining, or failure to achieve and maintain clinical competency, licensure and certification, relationship with the Board of Nursing, client families, co-workers, and advanced nursing practice. So these are areas where the most investigations for conduct derogatory to the standards are done. Now, you can be investigated and not necessarily have your license revoked, encumbered, or have any kind of an action taken against you. When they go through and review the conduct derogatory to nursing, they found that there were some common grounds for disciplinary action by the Board of Nursing. And these are the most common ones that are out there. Deceit in securing a license, fraud or deceit in the practice of nursing, incompetence, failure to supervise, gross negligence or abuse, habitual use of drugs or alcohol, aiding and abetting a person involved in a crime, and conviction of a crime. Also, physical or mental condition that makes the licensee unable to practice safely, violation of any provisions within the Nurse Practice Act, revocation or suspension of a nursing license by another state, violation of any condition imposed by the board when issuing a limited license. A limited license is also called an encumbered license, and failure to report actual or suspected abuse. Remember, we are mandatory reporters, so we are required by law to report if we are made aware of or see anything that relates to potential child abuse or elder abuse. So, in closure, you need to protect your rice bowl. Only you can protect your rice bowl. The facility in which you are working will simply hire another nurse. You could lose your license or have it encumbered. So protect your rice bowl, know your scope of practice.